Edward VII's wife endured his tragic death with dignity and grace. The same can't be said for his much younger mistress. When Alice Keppel heard that Edward was ill, she rushed to the gate of Buckingham Palace, waving a letter from Edward to gain entrance. The guards finally relented, though it's likely that when they heard what she did inside, they regretted that decision. In public, the Victorians were some of the stuffiest, snobbiest, most repressed people in history. Behind closed doors, it was a different story. In private, Victorian England was rife with drink, debauchery and scandal, and no one did it better than Queen Victoria's infamous son, King Edward VII. His bedroom escapades fueled the gossip mill for centuries, and his mother was utterly ashamed of him. But more than anything, Dirty Bertie knew how to be a royal with style. The future King Edward VII was born on November 9th, 1841, in the lavish Buckingham Palace. His parents called him Albert Edward, but quickly took to calling him Bertie. Bertie was the eldest son and therefore heir to the throne of England from the moment he was born. Queen Victoria and her husband, Prince Albert, wanted to make sure their son learned how to be a proper king. Edward's older sister, Victoria, was a brilliant little student. The prince, not so much. He desperately wanted to impress his parents, but he just wasn't cut out for the studious life. His tutors noted that while his academic abilities were lacking, the boy was nevertheless overflowing with charm, a trait that would serve him for his entire life. But Victoria and Prince Albert weren't interested in charm. They looked at their son and saw a failure. And it was only a matter of time before Bertie cracked under the pressure. At 19 years old, he found his true calling in life. He took an official tour of North America as the Prince of Wales. Everywhere he went, massive crowds came to greet him. Years of facing his parents' disappointment had left him a rather shy boy with low self-esteem. The amazing success of his time in North America worked wonders, and suddenly the young man was bursting with confidence. And what's a wealthy, charismatic young royal to do with all that confidence? Women. The answer is women. In 1861, Edward's folks sent him to Germany, apparently to watch some military manoeuvres. If you think that seems like a pretty dubious reason to travel across the continent, you'd be right. Edward's parents had an ulterior motive. Edward was now nearly 20 years old. It was long past time to find him a wife. He showed up in Germany and, wouldn't you know it, the woman his parents wanted him to marry happened to be there at the exact same time. Edward met Princess Alexandra of Denmark, or Alex as her family called her, and the two of them hit it off. Pretty soon their families had a marriage agreement in place, but there was just one problem. Alexandra wasn't the only woman that young Bertie was talking to. Not long before travelling to Germany, Edward had taken another trip, this time to Ireland. There he met actress Nellie Clifton, the first in a long, long line of mistresses. Edward had been sent to Ireland to get some army experience, but his fellow cadets were only too happy to enable the rebellious prince's dalliance. They allowed Nellie Clifton to hide out in their barracks for 3 days while she and Edward had their fun. Supposedly, Edward lost his virginity to Clifton during those 3 days. At 19 years old, Prince Bertie was having the time of his life, but it was all about to come crashing down. If there's one thing Victorians liked to do, it's gossip, so it didn't take long for word of Edward's affair to reach his parents. Prince Albert was already in ill health when he travelled to Ireland to tear his son a new one. The two of them apparently took a long walk in the rain together, and not only did Albert's stern words do nothing to curb his son's womanising, the pouring rain didn't do his health any favours. Albert passed away from his illness, thought to be Crohn's disease, just 2 short weeks after his talk with his son. Queen Victoria was beside herself with grief, and she wore mourning clothes for the rest of her life. But some of her pain turned to anger. She had never been fond of young Bertie, mostly because she thought he was a screw-up. While she once found him embarrassing, now she despised him. Between his grief over his father's passing and his mother's hatred, you'd think maybe this was the time where Edward finally decided to clean up his act. But you'd be wrong. He married Alexandra of Denmark at Windsor Castle on March 10th, 1863. But there was no wedding ring on earth that was going to keep Edward VII tied to one woman. By all accounts, Edward and Alexandra's marriage was a happy one, but that's only because Alexandra put up with Edward's most scandalous habit. He continued to take mistresses for their entire marriage. No one knows the exact number, but historians have tied at least 55 women to Edward. It was around this time that King Edward VII of England gained his most infamous nickname, Dirty Bertie. Despite his countless affairs, Edward never once acknowledged a single illegitimate child. Now, based on just the law of numbers, either he was the least fertile man alive or he was lying. I wonder which one it was. In 1864, Lady Susan Vane Tempest lost her husband. In her grief, she fell into the arms of none other than our guy Eddie. A letter to Edward from one of Susan's confidants in 1871 said that the crisis was due within 2 or 3 months, a not so well veiled allusion to Susan's pregnancy. Whether by choice or coercion, Susan never mentioned the child, and she took the secret to her grave when she died at just 36 years old. In 1869, the prince was embroiled in a much higher profile scandal when Sir Charles Mordaunt, a member of Parliament, threatened to name him in his divorce from his wife, Harriet Moncrief. Sir Charles had found salacious letters from the Prince of Wales in his wife's writing desk, and not only that, he came home early one day to find his wife and the prince alone together. He didn't actually catch them in bed together, but this is the Victorian era we're talking about. Finding a man and a woman alone in a house was enough to make people faint. After Mordaunt kicked the prince out, his anger apparently hadn't subsided, and he had to take his rage out on something. He allegedly shot 2 ponies and made his wife watch. I guess that's the aristocratic equivalent of kicking the cat. In the end, the courts didn't find Edward legally responsible for anything, but the damage to his reputation was done. As for Lady Mordaunt, her lawyers pleaded insanity as a defence for her adultery, and while Edward was free to continue gallivanting across Europe, sleeping with anything that moved, she spent the rest of her life hidden from sight, eventually being placed in a lunatic asylum. Unfortunately, the women who slept with Edward kept on meeting sad fates, and in 1871, Edward himself nearly did too. Edward was still a young man, and his scandals were starting to pile up, but still, the people couldn't help but love him. By all accounts, Edward was wildly charismatic and popular, and after what happened in 1871, they only loved him more. While staying in a hunting lodge, Edward came down with deadly typhoid fever, the same disease that was thought at the time to have claimed his father. Sure, the prince was a bit of a handful, but he was still beloved, and losing him so young would have been a national tragedy. Edward eventually recovered, and all of England rejoiced, and it's little wonder people loved him so much. Despite his faults, Edward was actually kind of a cool guy. Those around Edward couldn't help but remark that the prince treated everybody with dignity and respect, no matter their class or colour. On a trip to India, his letters home show that the racism he found in the country sickened him. Today that's just baseline human decency, but in the heyday of the British Empire, that kind of talk was pretty much unheard of. And at a time when anti-Semitism was rife in proper English society, he drew criticism for fraternising with the Jewish Rothschild family. Edward managed to keep his affairs out of the papers for a few years after the Mordaunt scandal, but it was only a matter of time before he started turning heads once again. In 1877, he went to the theatre and fell head over heels for one of the actresses. Her name was Lily Langtry, and after she entranced the prince on stage, he quickly organised a meet-cute. He showed up at a dinner party she was attending and arranged it so that he sat right next to her. The consummate charmer, Edward and Langtry hit it off immediately. They kept up their not-so-secret tryst for about 3 years until Langtry hit Edward with a jaw-dropping truth. She was pregnant. Though it's impossible to know for sure, most historians believe Edward was not the father of Langtry's child. Apparently he wasn't the only one who liked to play the field. And while Edward and Lily's physical relationship ended when she became pregnant, this wasn't a dramatic falling out. The prince and the starlet remained on good terms for the rest of their lives. It seems like, despite everything, Edward was genuinely a pretty decent guy at his core. Everyone could see it, except for his mother. Throughout the 1880s and 90s, Edward didn't spend that much time in England. Probably something to do with the fact that his own mother couldn't even stand to look at him. Edward wanted an escape, and he found it in the Parisian underworld, where he soon became something of a legend. Edward likely patronised every high-class cat house in Paris, but his favourite by far was the infamous Les Chabonnets. He visited so often he actually had his own room, complete with his coat of arms over the bed, and an extravagant copper bathtub with a massive half-woman, half-swan figurehead. Women were Edward's biggest vice, but he had plenty more to go around. Second on the list was probably food, and by the 1880s, Edward had a huge waistline to match his appetite. His enormous belly started to interfere with his earthly desires, so he had Louis Subrier, a famous cabinet maker, design the siège d'amour, or love chair, this bizarre looking thing, so that he could still enjoy the fruits of the working girls, sometimes several at once, without them being crushed under his weight. Thou only lives once, I suppose. If you frequented the Parisian nightlife in the 1880s and 90s, you were bound to bump into Edward VII sooner or later. He enjoyed the city's nightclubs, especially the legendary Moulin Rouge, where he'd frequently appear with a new French socialite or actress on his arm every week. Compared to the grim and depressing London, where the shadow of his mother and her perpetual mourning hung over him like a storm cloud, it's little wonder Edward spent so much time in Paris. But life can't be all naughty chairs and burlesque shows. Edward actually had a whole brood of kids back in England. By all accounts, Princess Alexandra, remember her, was totally fine with her husband's womanising. She even welcomed several of his mistresses into their home and acknowledged them in public. But not even Edward could keep it up forever, so to speak. Now, that's not to say he completely gave up womanising. He had mistresses until the day he died. He just slowed down a little and found time for new bad habits. And at the top of the list, gambling. Edward had somehow managed to go a few years without a major public scandal, but all of that was about to change. In 1890, he joined a bunch of other upper crust types at the home of one Arthur Wilson for some friendly high-stakes baccarat. This might seem innocuous compared to the prince's usual activities, but this soon unravelled into one of the biggest scandals to rock the royal family in years. First of all, the game was completely against the law to begin with. Second, one of Edward's friends, Sir William Gordon Cumming, was caught cheating. Tempers flared, and the whole mess ended up going to court. The court actually called Edward to testify, the first time any English court had called an heir to the throne to the stand in over 400 years. In the end, the courts found Gordon Cumming guilty of cheating. Victorians were weird, and they took things like that extremely seriously, so they kicked him out of the army and completely ostracised him from polite society. Meanwhile, the prince's reputation took a serious hit, and the public's opinion of him hit rock bottom. Edward never really grew out of his roots as a problem child, so what happened when he had a problem child of his own? His eldest son, Prince Albert Victor, was next in line to the throne, and it seems like the young prince took after his dad, because as he grew into a young man, rumours started swirling around him too. From wild affairs to male prostitution scandals to rumours that he was secretly Jack the Ripper, Prince Albert Victor managed to be nearly as scandalous as his old man, until tragedy struck. Prince Albert Victor was only 27 years old and in the prime of his life when the influenza pandemic of 1889 ravaged England, and the strapping young prince fell victim to the disease. He died from pneumonia on January 14th, 1892, and Edward's heartbreaking letters reveal just how devastated he was. He wrote to his mother, "To lose our eldest son is one of those calamities one can never really get over. I would have given my life for him, as I put no value on mine." Between the loss of his son and the royal baccarat scandal, Edward seemingly put his womanising aside for a time, but no amount of tragedy could get this dude to keep it in his pants for long. A few years later, he met Alice Keppel, a woman 26 years his junior. Keppel had at least one thing going for her in Edward's eyes. She was married, and clearly the prince was into that kind of thing. Edward tended to treat the women who shared his bed extremely well, often long after their affairs ended. He couldn't just flat out give Alice Keppel money from the royal purse, but instead he gave her shares in a rubber company. She earned a cool £50,000 out of that deal, about £7.5 million today. Even her poor husband got something out of the arrangement. Edward found him a new job with a way better salary. Lady Randolph Churchill, aka Winston Churchill's mum, was no stranger to scandal. The same gossips who dished on Edward's many affairs had nearly as many stories about her. It was only a matter of time before the two of them crossed paths. Stop me if you've heard this one before. The gentleman husband comes home, only to find his wife alone in the company of, yep, this guy. You can't take your eye off him for a second, can you? Dirty Bertie was the Prince of Wales for a long, long time, but even Victoria couldn't live forever, and on January 22nd, 1901, she died at the age of 81. Now, at the ripe old age of 60, he finally became King Edward VII. Victoria's worst fear had come true. She spent her life assuming he'd make a terrible king, but Edward was full of surprises. His coronation went about exactly as you would expect. He invited several of his mistresses to attend and even made sure the event organisers set aside a specific pew for the king's special ladies. Scandals or not, Edward was one of the most popular men in England. The nation rejoiced when he became king. In the end, Victoria was wrong about her screw-up of a son. He was a breath of fresh air after so many years of Victoria's stern and stuffy rule. But sadly, it didn't last long. Remember all those 10-course meals? Victoria reigned for 63 years. Edward didn't even make it to 10. By 1909, his health began to fail. He fainted during a state visit to Berlin, and a year after that, he collapsed during a visit to France. And Edward's health troubles couldn't have come at a worse time. England was in the midst of a constitutional crisis. They had elected a Liberal government, but the staunchly conservative House of Lords refused to pass their budget. It was the kind of thing that needed Edward's complete attention. But the king was too sick to travel back to England. And to make matters worse, his attendants kept news of his illness a secret, so everyone in England assumed he was just off gallivanting in France like the old days. His health continued to get worse, but contrary to what his mother expected, Edward took his role as king extremely seriously. On May 6, 1910, he suffered several heart attacks. His doctors tried to urge him to his bed, but he refused, insisting on working to the end. Before long, he was too weak to stand, and he passed away that night. Dirty Bertie, Edward the Caresser, King Edward VII, was gone. When his funeral ended, attendants opened the hall to the public, and mourning crowds arrived in droves to pay their respects. Before Edward's burial, over 400,000 people filed past his coffin in just 2 days. The incorrigible prince turned beloved king was gone, and the people wanted to say goodbye, as did many of his mistresses. But most of them did it with a lot more tact than Alice Keppel. When she heard that Edward was on his deathbed, she dropped everything and ran to Buckingham Palace. When she arrived, she demanded entry, allegedly waving a letter from the king himself. The guards relented and allowed her inside, though no doubt they soon regretted that decision. Completely unable to control herself, Keppel made such a scene that even the infinitely patient Alexandra had had enough. The Queen had her guards escort Keppel outside. and that was the end of Alice Keppel's time in the upper echelons of English society. But her legacy does live on in today's royal family. The current king, Charles, is married to Keppel's great-granddaughter, Camilla Parker Bowles. Those royals really do like to keep it in the family. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos.